Hi everyone, hope you're all good today. So, I've been looking at some of the testimony from the Jerry Burns trial. Specifically, I've been looking at the testimony of Dr. Michael Spence, who is the defense's forensic DNA specialist. And I was kind of trying to get an idea of what Ann Taylor's approach might be when it comes to the Idaho 4 case and her different options when it comes to tackling the DNA situation. The approach that was used in the Jerry Burns trial, I personally don't think is something that Ann Taylor is going to use. I have a feeling that she's going to be looking more towards the IgG situation instead of what this case what this case's defense was looking for, which was something more to do with transfer events in terms of DNA. However, it doesn't mean that this isn't an option for Ann Taylor. And I do want to start going through all of the different approaches to how this sheath can be argued in court. So the Jerry Burns trial, and specifically this testimony of this expert, is very extensive. It's quite a lot. So I've divided up just a few timestamps, and I'm just going to go through them one video at a time. So today's video is really short. It's really just very introductory, but it does kind of get into what trace DNA is and some of its mechanisms of movement. So I think the time stamp on the testimony is less than a minute. We'll just watch it. I think talk about it less than a minute probably. I did make a little diagram for you guys. And then probably next week, we'll carry on with the same testimony and look at another little timestamp that I've taken out, which relates to bundling. And I want to see how that could apply in Idaho 4 in terms of things like the comforter and materials that fold over each other. But let me not get ahead of myself. Today is just introductory. I think that this is interesting because these are the kind of experts that Ann Taylor is going to want to enlist when it comes to trial and when it comes to tackling this knife sheath in the Idaho 4 case.
That's the most important part. It says trace DNA, and that's a little vague, but we're talking about small amounts of DNA in some instances that are going to be detected on criminal case evidence. As we go around, there are descriptions of ways that trace amounts of DNA and sometimes more than trace amounts of DNA can arrive on those items that are being analyzed. It can be from coughs, sneezes, speaking as I'm doing right now. I'm sure my DNA is right here on this microphone head. Touching, we know now that things you touch, you're going to leave behind skin cells. Dilute fluids, and this would refer to body fluids, presumably. That's what we're talking about here. Sweat, blood, semen, saliva. There are other body fluids that are involved. Mucus. There can be indirect transfer. So you can have DNA transferred from a person onto an object through any of those mechanisms I just described, and then transferred subsequently to another object. And this has been tested in research studies way too many times, probably. The hundreds of papers that have come out, research papers on that. And just talking about the kind of objects we can see from one person to another person. You can get DNA onto another person from the first person. Shaking hands is an easy example. Hugging. At crime scenes, there can be transfer events from people who arrive at that crime scene prior to the crime scene, during the crime scene, after the crime scene. There can be transfer events. These are concerns for handling DNA as far as contamination for the people who collect crime scene evidence. So these are all objects and persons that can have an effect on what we ultimately see on items at the end, where we're taking a snapshot essentially with our DNA typing as to what's on that item at the very end of the analytical step.
Okay, so that was mostly self-explanatory, but what we did get from that is that when it comes to trace DNA, which is very small amounts of DNA, there's various ways in which it can be moved around, which result in, forensically speaking, which would result in it being detectable on items of physical evidence. Now, the way that it moves around does seem, from what I've heard here, to also depend on the type of DNA or the source of the DNA. So if you're looking at something like coughing, that's you're not going to cough up skin cells necessarily. I mean, maybe there are some circumstances where you can, but that's something that's a little bit more unique to the transfer mechanism of touch. So there's a couple of things at play when you're looking at different types of movement mechanisms. However, what the movement means is that it will find itself on items of evidence because it's not static. So it's crucial to note that when it comes to these different types of movement, they can be direct or indirect. And in terms of indirect, that can be something that's really complicated and quite difficult to retrace, which is why I'm not entirely sure if a defense strategy like this would be the best approach. It came up in this case as well with the Jerry Burns case and the testimony of this particular expert witness that these events, these transfer events, are they can introduce some doubt because they're possible, but it's not something so easy to be able to retrace and say this is why this DNA is here. So, in terms of these indirect mechanisms, they would need to involve a kind of intermediary for that movement. So, it's not a straightforward movement of DNA from one item to another. And if you haven't seen CJ's glove video, do go and watch that because this explains it quite well. It reminds me a little bit of the case of Lucas Anderson, which is also will come up in this testimony more towards the end. So we're definitely going to get to that as well. Personally, I don't think that this would have very good implications for the knife sheath in the Idaho 4 case. If there is something else notable going on with the IgG, then it might be better to focus on that. However, I suppose there's nothing to say that we can't examine both options. This expert seems to be saying that these kinds of events with transfer of trace DNA are not as unlikely as we've been previously led to believe in the field of forensics historically. So, I do hope you enjoyed that. I hope that it helped. And further on in the week, we're going to start with the concept of bundling. From this exact testimony, I'm going to look at things like the comforter, try and see if there are any implications for uh, pieces of material being folded over in the bed of Madison Mogen, things like what Madison Mogen may have been wearing, if what would be the difference if she changed after she got out of the vehicle that frequently gives other people lifts. Is that impactful? Can we use any of this testimony, this expert testimony of Dr. Michael Spence, in the Idaho 4 case, even though they're quite different in terms of the actual case facts? Can we carry that logic through? I think that there are some instances where it is helpful. Okay, so uh, that's all from me today. I hope you have a beautiful weekend further, and bye. Keep well.